I want you to picture a docking bay the size of a small city. Not a building, a city. Steel ribs holding up a ceiling you can't see the top of because the fog from 1,000 coolant vents just eats the light before it gets that high. That was HFY Station, sitting quiet in the space between three trade routes, the kind of place where nobody important ever stayed longer than it took to refuel. I worked cargo intake there for 6 years, long enough to know every hum the station made, every creak that meant nothing and every creak that meant something. Long enough to know the guards by the sound of their boots before I ever saw their faces. And long enough to know Torrin Vance wasn't like the other humans. I need to explain something first, because if you weren't out here in the deep lanes, you won't understand why what happened that night mattered so much. Humans didn't have a reputation back then. Not a good one, not a bad one. They were new, loud mostly, overly polite in the way that made older species nervous, because politeness from something you don't understand yet feels like a held breath before something breaks. Vance was quiet, though. He didn't talk much. He did his 12-hour rotations at Gate 7, checked manifests, waved through the traders, and went back to whatever crate he called quarters. Nobody paid him any mind. Why would they? A human in a security vest, standing at a gate that saw maybe 40 ships a cycle. Nothing about him screamed anything. Until the night the Havorn convoy came in. I remember the exact moment I knew something was wrong, because the whole bay went quiet in a way that wasn't natural. You know how a market sounds right before a fight breaks out? That little dip in the noise, like everyone's lungs paused at the same second. That. 3 ships, Cording Dominion colors, that deep bruised purple with the gold trim, the kind of paint job that costs more than most people's whole lives. Cording soldiers didn't usually come this far out. Their territory was 6 jumps away, minimum. So when 3 of their cruisers dropped out of slip space right over HFY and started demanding a priority dock, everybody with half a brain found somewhere else to be. I didn't. I was stuck on shift, elbow deep in a manifest dispute with a Threll trader who wouldn't stop arguing about tariff codes, of all things, while a Dominion warship was parking outside like it owned the place. The soldiers came off the lead ship in formation. 6 of them. Big, not human big, bigger. Cording stand almost 8 feet when they're not hunching, and these weren't hunching. Armor plated in that same bruised purple, faces mostly hidden behind visors that glowed faint amber. They walked like they'd never once in their lives had a door not open for them. Leading them was an officer. Younger than the others, I think, though it's hard to tell with Cordon. Their rank markings are subtle unless you know what you're looking at. He had a voice that carried without him raising it. That's the scary kind. The kind of person who's never had to shout because everyone always just listens. He said they were here for a fugitive. I remember the word landing in that bay like a dropped crate. Fugitive on HFY. We didn't get fugitives here. We got smugglers, sure, small-time cargo skimmers, the occasional drunk brawl outside the tavern deck. Not fugitives with a Dominion strike team attached. The officer had a manifest photo pulled up on a floating display. A child. Not human. Vesari, small, slight-boned species, skin with a faint blue-gray shimmer to it, big dark eyes that take up half the face when they're young. This one couldn't have been more than 9, 10 years old in whatever years Vesari count by. The photo showed her standing in front of what looked like a school building, half smiling at whoever was taking the picture. The officer said her family had been involved in an uprising on a Dominion colony world. Said she was being moved through the deep lanes by sympathizers. Said the Dominion considered her, and I'm using his exact words here because I've never forgotten them, a person of continuing interest to colonial security. A 10-year-old, a person of continuing interest. Nobody in that bay said anything. What were we supposed to say? The Dominion had 3 warships sitting outside. You don't argue tariff codes with 3 warships. That's when Vance walked over from Gate 7. I want to be honest with you about this part because I've told this story a few times since, and I always catch myself wanting to make him look more dramatic than he was. He didn't storm over. He didn't have some big cinematic stride. He just walked, the way he always walked, hands loose at his sides, and he stood next to the intake desk like he was there to ask about a shipment. "There's a problem here," he said. The cordon officer looked down at him, and I mean down, because Vance came up to about the man's chest, and I watched something flicker behind that amber visor. Not fear. Cordon don't really do fear, not visibly. More like recalculation. Like he was trying to figure out what category to put this in. "Station security," the officer said. It wasn't a question. It was dismissal. "That's right," Vance said. "So when armed soldiers come onto my dock talking about hauling off a kid, that kind of becomes my business." I heard someone next to me suck in a breath. The Threll trader I'd been arguing with actually took a step back, like the air near Vance had gotten dangerous just by association. The officer said the girl wasn't on the station. Not yet. She was aboard an incoming transport still 40 minutes out, and Dominion forces would be taking custody the moment it docked, with or without station cooperation. And Vance, I still think about this, the way he said it, so calm it almost sounded bored. Vance said, "Not on my dock, you won't." Here's where I have to slow down, because everything that happened in the next 40 minutes is the kind of thing that gets told wrong if you rush it. It wasn't a fight. Nobody drew a weapon in that first stretch. It was worse than that, in a way. It was a standoff made entirely of words, and words are a strange kind of battlefield because you can't see who's winning until it's over. The officer explained, very patiently, the way you'd explain something to a child who didn't understand the rules, that Dominion writ superseded local station authority in matters of colonial security. He said Kesh Vanter's charter, filed with the consortium 60 years back, had a clause, and he actually pulled it up, right there on his wrist display, like he'd memorized exactly where to find it. A clause granting transitory enforcement to any recognized colonial power in pursuit of a lawful fugitive. Vance didn't argue the law, that's the part that got me. He didn't try to outlawyer a man who clearly had the whole thing memorized. He just said, "Funny thing about that clause says lawful fugitive, not lawful person of interest, not lawful witness. Fugitive. That means she's been charged with something." Silence. "Because far as I know," Vance went on, "you don't charge 10-year-olds with uprisings, not even the Dominions that far gone. So either she's a fugitive, and you can show me the charge, or she's a kid you want to grab because of who her parents were, and that's not a legal matter. That's just cruelty with a badge on it." I watched the officer's jaw tighten under the visor. You could see the shape of it even through the amber. "You will step aside," the officer said. "I will not." That's it. That's what he said. 3 words. No shake in his voice. No hand near a weapon. Station security doesn't even carry lethal arms, just stun batons, and his was still clipped to his belt the whole time. He just stood there, one human against 6 cordon soldiers and however many more waiting on those ships, and said I will not, like he was declining a second cup of caf. More people gathered by then. Word travels fast in a place like Kesh Vanter, faster than any ship in dock. Dockhands, traders, a couple of off-duty pilots, even a maintenance crew that came down from the upper gantry still holding their tools. Nobody said much. Nobody joined Vance, not physically. What were unarmed dockworkers going to do against Dominion soldiers? But they stood there. They watched. And I think that mattered more than anyone realized at the time, because courting culture puts enormous weight on being seen. Witnesses change what a soldier's willing to do. The officer tried a different angle. He said the girl's transport was arriving regardless of station interference, and that when it did, Dominion forces would take custody by force if necessary, and any human standing in the way would be, quote, treated as an accessory to insurrection. Vance's face didn't change. but something in his shoulders did settled lower, like a man bracing for weight he'd already decided to carry. "Then I guess I'm an accessory," he said. The officer studied him a long moment, and then he asked, and I think this is the part of the story people remember most, because it's the part that isn't about bravery, it's about the question underneath the bravery. He asked, "Why? She is nothing to you, not your species, not your world, not your war." And Vance said something I've turned over in my head more times than I can count since. "She's 10, he said. "I don't need her to be my species for that to matter." The transport arrived 12 minutes early. I remember the alarm on that, the little chirp of the arrivals board flipping over sooner than scheduled, and how the whole bay seemed to lean toward the gate at once. It was a beaten-up little freighter, the kind that's been resold 9 times and patched with parts from 4 different manufacturers. It docked at gate 11, 4 gates down from where Vance and the officer had been standing off, and I watched the courting soldiers peel away toward it like water finding a drain. Vance moved faster than I expected a man his size to move. He got to gate 11 before the ramp even finished lowering. The girl came down first, small, wrapped in a traveler's cloak too big for her, clutching the sleeve of the woman walking behind her. Not her mother, I found out later, some family friend who'd been smuggling her through the lanes for weeks. The girl's eyes found the soldiers waiting at the bottom of the ramp, and I watched her whole body go still in that particular way children go still when they already understand more about danger than any child should. The officer stepped forward, said something formal, some Dominion phrase about lawful apprehension. And Vance stepped between them. Not dramatically, not with his arms out like some old broadcast hero. He just walked over, crouched down so he was eye level with the girl and said, "Hey, you're safe. Nobody's taking you anywhere you don't want to go." Then he stood back up, turned to face the officer, and put himself squarely in the gap between the girl and 6 armed soldiers. I think this is where I need to tell you what I actually saw, because it's not what you'd expect from a story like this. There was no grand fight, no blaster fire lighting up the dock. What happened was quieter and, honestly, scarier in its own way. The lead soldier, not the officer, one of the others, a big one with a scar cutting through his visor's lower edge, reached out to physically move Vance aside. Just a shove, the kind you'd give someone blocking a doorway. Vance didn't move. I want to be clear about the physics of this because I've thought about it 100 times since. A cordon soldier in full armor probably weighs 3 times what a human does. That shove should have put Vance on the ground. It didn't. He planted his feet, took the hit through his shoulder, and stayed exactly where he was standing, like something had bolted him to the deck plating. The soldier looked confused. I could see it even through the visor, that little pause, the recalibration. He shoved again, harder. Vance still didn't move. And this time he grabbed the soldier's wrist. Not to fight him, just to hold him there, steady, the way you'd hold a door that was trying to swing shut. And he said, real quiet, "You really want to do this in front of 40 witnesses and a station security feed that's been recording since the second your ships dropped out of slip space?" That landed. I watched it land. Because courting Dominion soldiers, whatever else they are, answer to a command structure that cares deeply about optics. An officer dragging a screaming child off a civilian dock, on record in front of a crowd, was not the kind of footage that helps a career. The officer barked something in Cordon fast, clipped, a language that always sounds like snapped branches when they're angry, and the soldier let go of Vance's grip and stepped back. For a second I actually thought that was it. I thought they'd back down. Then the officer drew his sidearm. The whole bay flinched. I felt it happen around me, this collective intake of breath, 40-something people all bracing at once. The girl behind Vance made a sound I still hear sometimes, this small broken gasp, and buried her face against the woman holding her. Vance didn't reach for his stun baton, didn't put his hands up. He just looked at that weapon and then looked back at the officer's visor and said, "Go ahead." I don't think anyone expected that. I certainly didn't. You shoot an unarmed station guard on a neutral dock, in front of every trader and pilot in this bay, and you'd better believe that footage reaches every consortium relay inside a week. Every port from here to the Havorn Reach is going to know exactly what the Dominion does to people who say no to it. You want that story, because I'm happy to be in it. The officer's hand didn't waver. Not right away. I watched that barrel stay level, watched Vance stand there with his chest an open target, and I swear that stretch of seconds felt longer than anything I've lived through before or since. Then from somewhere behind me, one of the pilots, a grizzled old thrall who flew supply runs and never said 2 words to anybody, stepped forward and said, loud enough for the whole bay to hear, "I'm recording too. Independent feed. Not station-owned. Can't be wiped." And then another voice, and another, a dockhand, a maintenance tech still holding her wrench like it might matter. One by one people said it, recording, recording, recording. Not a threat exactly, just a fact offered up like a wall being built brick by brick around one human standing in a doorway. The officer's arm finally lowered. He didn't apologize. Men like that don't. He said something about the matter being escalated to consortium arbitration, said the station would answer for interference, said a lot of things that were meant to sound like a threat but came out sounding like retreat dressed up in formal language. Then he turned, and his soldiers turned with him, and they walked back to their ships in that same unbothered formation they'd walked in with, except it wasn't the same. You could see it if you were watching close. The rhythm was off. 6 men who'd come in certain of themselves, walking out like the ground had shifted somewhere under their boots, and they hadn't figured out yet how to stand on it. The ships lifted maybe 20 minutes later, no fanfare. Just 3 cruisers pulling away from dock and vanishing back into slip space, and Kesh Vanter breathing out all at once. This whole station exhaling like it had been holding its breath for an hour. Vance crouched back down in front of the girl. She was still shaking. He didn't touch her, didn't crowd her, just stayed low and let her look at him for as long as she needed. "What's your name?" he asked. It took her a while to answer. When she did, her voice was so small I almost didn't catch it. "Isvin," she said. "Isvin?" He said it back like it mattered, like he was making sure he'd hold on to it right. "You did good today, you know that. You were scared and you stood here anyway. That's the hard part. That's the part most people never have to find out they're capable of." She didn't say anything back, but she reached out, hesitant, and put her small gray-blue hand against his arm just for a second, like she was checking he was real. I found out later, much later, through the kind of quiet channels that move information nobody wants official, that Isvin's parents hadn't been part of any uprising at all. They'd been teachers on a colony world that started asking too many questions about resource allocation, and the Dominion's idea of dealing with inconvenient questions had never been subtle. Her parents were gone by the time she reached Kesh Vanter. Nobody ever told her the details, and nobody who knew was in a hurry to. The family friend who'd smuggled her through the lanes got her onto a consortium relief transport 2 days later, headed toward a resettlement world outside Dominion reach. I stood at the gate when she left, along with a good number of the same people who'd stood there the night the soldiers came. Isvin hugged Vance before she boarded. Didn't say much. Just held on for a long moment, the way you hold on to something you're scared you won't get to hold again. Vance never talked about that night much afterward. I tried asking him once, months later, why he did it, really asking, not the way the officer had asked it as a challenge, but genuinely wanting to understand what makes a person stand in front of 6 armed soldiers for someone they'd known all of 10 minutes. He thought about it for a while before he answered, longer than I expected. "Somebody has to be the reason it doesn't happen," he said finally. "If everybody waits for somebody else to be that reason, it never is anybody. Might as well be me." I've told this story more times than I can count since I left Kesh Vanter. told it in bars, told it to new dockhands who never met Vance and probably never will, told it once to a consortium historian who wanted it for some archive of notable transit incidents, which felt like the wrong word for what it was. People always ask the same question at the end. They ask what happened to Vance, whether the Dominion ever came back for him, whether there were consequences, whether the story has some big dramatic finish where the hero gets his due. Truth is, he just kept working Gate 7, checking manifests, waving through traders. As far as I know, he's still out there somewhere in the deep lanes, doing the same quiet job, being the same quiet man nobody looks twice at until the moment it matters. But I think about what the galaxy saw that night and what I saw and how different those two things were. The galaxy, the Dominion, the records, the official version of events. The galaxy saw an obstacle, a problem to root around. Maybe in their reports they called him a threat. Maybe they called him worse. But I was standing on that dock. I saw a man who had every reason to step aside and every excuse ready if he had. And instead he crouched down to a scared kid's eye level and made himself into the only thing standing between her and people with guns. The galaxy saw a monster in that standoff, I think. They just picked the wrong side to call it. Because the only thing worth protecting that night wasn't power, or law, or a clause in some 60-year-old charter. It was a 10-year-old girl who reached out to touch a stranger's arm, just to make sure he was really there.